Judge laughs at black woman in court, then freezes when she flashes her USSS badge. The courtroom doors burst open, jolting even the most composed spectators. Two bailiffs marched in, gripping a woman by the arms as if she were dangerous. Her navy blue suit, once pristine, was now wrinkled and stained. That woman was Maya Jennings. Her wrists, raw from tight handcuffs, bore silent testimony to her mistreatment. The room fell into an eerie silence. Eyes followed her, not with curiosity, but with judgment. No one saw a professional. No one cared who she really was. In their minds, she was already guilty, because she was a black woman on trial. The moment Maya was shoved into the defendant's chair, Judge Ronald Mercer peered down from his bench with disdain etched into every wrinkle of his aging face. A man well into his 70s, Mercer was a relic of an older, darker system, one who wore his robe not to dispense justice, but to exert control. His silver hair was neatly combed, his black robe immaculate, but his voice dripped with venom. He didn't hide his contempt. In fact, he relished it. "Well," he said, his voice slow and patronizing, his lips curled into a bitter smirk. "Look what we have here. Another one who thinks the rules don't apply to her." The words echoed through the courtroom like a slap. A few spectators even chuckled, low and cruel. The prosecutor looked down at his notes, saying nothing, pretending not to hear. Maya said nothing, her jaw clenched, her eyes fixed forward. Her silence was not submission, it was strategy, but Judge Mercer mistook it for weakness. "I assume you'll be giving us the usual speech," he continued, mocking her with every syllable. "How you were wrongfully arrested, profiled, mistreated, how society is so unfair to people like you." That phrase, "people like you," hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Maya didn't flinch, but inside every word ignited a fire that had been smoldering for years. Mercer leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "You see, Miss Jennings, the court is tired of entitled individuals walking in here thinking they're above the law. You're not special, you're not different, and frankly, I've seen your type too many times to care." The venom in his voice struck like a dagger. He wasn't judging her based on evidence or law. He had already decided who she was based on the color of her skin and the firmness of her gaze. To him, confidence in a black woman was arrogance. Silence was guilt. Dignity was defiance. He hated it all. The bailiff stood close by, arms folded, ready to subdue her at the slightest motion. The jurors sat stiffly, eyes darting between each other, unsure whether to pity her or condemn her. The prosecutor still hadn't said a word, his silence a cowardly endorsement of the judge's prejudice. The room was thick with the stink of injustice. The walls, the benches, the polished floor, all of it seemed to close in on Maya like a trap. And yet, she didn't bend. She sat tall, her breathing steady, her fingers calmly rested on the edge of the defense table. But her eyes, God, her eyes, were locked on Mercer with the icy stillness of someone who had seen men like him rise and fall before. She was not here to beg. She was not here to plead for mercy. She was here for something far more dangerous. Truth. The gavel cracked sharply against the polished wood, shattering the heavy silence that had engulfed the courtroom. Judge Ronald Mercer leaned forward, glaring downward from his elevated seat with a thin, predatory smile. His fingers drummed impatiently on the polished surface of his bench as his gaze narrowed onto Maya Jennings, making no effort to hide his contempt. His voice, when he finally spoke, was dry and emotionless, like paper catching fire slowly at its edges. "Prosecutor Graves," he drawled slowly, clearly enjoying each syllable. "Let's hear the charges. Remind us exactly why Ms. Jennings is sitting here, wasting our time." Todd Graves rose from his chair, buttoning his expensive suit jacket with a smooth, practiced movement. He was younger than the judge, sharply dressed and cold-eyed, the kind of man whose every action was calculated. Graves positioned himself strategically, facing the jury directly, ignoring Maya completely, as if she had ceased to exist the moment she was seated. His voice was calm but ruthless, devoid of any empathy or hesitation. "Your Honor, members of the jury," Graves began, his tone icy, clinical, his eyes firmly avoiding Maya's unwavering gaze. "The defendant, Maya Jennings, stands accused of illegally entering a secure federal facility deliberately refusing direct orders to leave, and intentionally withholding identification when challenged by federal officers. He paused, allowing his carefully chosen words to linger heavily in the courtroom, making sure their implications settled in each juror's mind. Graves understood the power of silence. He wielded it like a weapon. He allowed the jury just enough time to form the image he'd painted. Maya Jennings as a defiant intruder, a trespasser, a threat. Not once did he acknowledge her calm composure, her dignified presence, or the raw bruises that still circled her wrists. He saw her merely as a case number, a problem to solve quickly and ruthlessly. According to testimony from several federal officers, Graves continued, now pacing slightly, his polished shoes clicking softly against the courtroom floor. The defendant gained access to the facility under false pretenses, ignored repeated commands to produce valid identification, and became combative when officers attempted to remove her from the premises. A murmur rippled through the audience. Maya felt every word hit her like physical blows. Yet outwardly she remained stoic, composed. Each accusation twisted the truth, but no one asked why. Nobody in that courtroom seemed interested in the facts. Not the judge, not the prosecutor, and certainly not the people who watched her with eyes filled with suspicion and prejudice. To them, her very presence was proof enough of guilt. Mercer watched Graves approvingly, nodding subtly at each accusation. The judge had clearly made up his mind already. He didn't even pretend to consider any possibility of innocence. His eyes were full of a quiet, simmering disdain, as if Maya's mere existence offended him. Graves turned briefly, finally acknowledging Maya's presence for the first time, his face a mask of cold efficiency. His voice hardened further. When given multiple opportunities to clarify her reasons for entering the restricted area, Ms. Jennings refused cooperation, displaying a troubling lack of respect for authority. Another pause. Graves let the weight of his words hang menacingly. Maya's jaw tightened imperceptibly. She understood what he was doing. He was painting her as arrogant, defiant, a woman who believed she was above the rules. But nobody in that courtroom had asked her why she was there. Not once had they given her a chance to speak, to explain, to clarify. They'd chosen their version of the truth, and now they expected her to accept it without protest. Graves lifted a file from his table, holding it high enough for the jury to see, deliberately dramatizing his next point. Here we have the sworn statements of the officers involved. They all agree that Maya Jennings demonstrated clear aggression, resistance, and a persistent refusal to identify herself. These officers followed standard procedure precisely, yet Ms. Jennings continues to deny wrongdoing. His words carried lethal precision. Each syllable was crafted to condemn her further, portraying Maya not only as guilty but also as defiant and disrespectful, someone dangerous enough to justify the bruises on her wrists, the harsh treatment, and the public humiliation. Graves lowered the file dramatically, his face expressionless, his eyes cold and distant. Judge Mercer's voice sliced through the tension abruptly. "Thank you, Mr. Graves. Your presentation is clear. It seems we have a defendant who believes rules and procedures simply do not apply to her. Perhaps she thinks being defiant grants her special privileges." His words dripped venomously, each one carefully aimed to dismantle Maya's dignity, piece by piece. He leaned closer, his voice a cruel whisper now, loud enough for everyone to hear, yet intimate enough to feel like a personal attack. "Let me be clear, Ms. Jennings. This court will not tolerate your arrogance or your refusal to acknowledge authority. People like you do not get special treatment. People like you must face consequences." That phrase, "people like you," hung heavily, the judge's unspoken message louder than any accusation Graves had leveled. Mercer's expression was triumphant, satisfied, certain he had put her firmly in her place. The entire courtroom seemed to close in on Maya, every eye watching her, every face silently judging her, every voice quietly condemning her without even hearing a single word in her defense. It felt suffocating, as though all the oxygen had suddenly vanished. Yet Maya did not break, did not cry out, did not bow her head. Her face remained steady, dignified, powerful in its silence. But inside, beneath the carefully controlled surface, Maya burned with righteous fury. She knew the truth. and she knew they would too. But right now, no one wanted to hear it. They didn't care that she had every right to be at that facility. They didn't care that her identification had been ignored deliberately, not withheld. They didn't care about justice. The truth was irrelevant to these men who wielded power without conscience. Mercer and Graves had already decided she was guilty. They didn't need facts or explanations. They wanted submission, obedience, and silence. Maya Jennings slowly rose from her seat, the scraping of the wooden chair against the polished courtroom floor echoing sharply through the tense silence. Every pair of eyes followed her movements carefully, waiting, some hopeful, many judgmental, but all of them watching intently. She straightened her posture deliberately, adjusting the sleeve of her navy blue suit jacket, though her wrists still burned and ached from the bruises left by the cuffs. She lifted her chin, her gaze calm yet piercing, her dark eyes locking firmly onto Judge Mercer's indifferent face. She allowed a single, calculated breath to pass before opening her mouth to speak. Her voice cut clearly through the oppressive air, quiet but unmistakably powerful, dripping with restrained precision. "Your Honor," she began, the title spoken without reverence, but as a subtle challenge. "I stand before this court accused of crimes I did not commit, accused by individuals who deliberately chose suspicion over truth. These charges against me are not about justice, or security, or law." She paused just enough for her words to resonate, to force every juror, every spectator, every person in that courtroom to grapple with their implication. Her voice tightened with controlled intensity. "No, these charges are about something far more sinister, hidden beneath the veneer of legality. They're about prejudice, discrimination, racism dressed in procedural formality." Her words were spoken with such sharp clarity that a ripple of unease passed through the room. The spectators shifted uncomfortably in their seats, eyes darting nervously toward the judge, who was leaning forward, his face flushed with amusement. Mercer let out a sudden laugh, booming and mocking, an abrupt sound that broke the fragile tension Maya had carefully woven. "Oh, racism now, is it?" Mercer sneered sarcastically, eyes glittering cruelly. His voice filled with arrogant mockery, amplifying his disdain. "That's your defense? You stand here accused of breaching federal security protocols, of blatantly defying direct lawful orders, and your response is to blame it on racism?" Mercer laughed again, louder this time, looking around theatrically to draw the gallery into his derision. A few spectators hesitantly joined in, encouraged by his reaction. The laughter stabbed sharply at Maya, an insult intended to diminish her credibility, to mock her struggle, to silence her truth. Mercer's voice lowered, becoming more intimate and viciously patronizing. He leaned forward even further, eyes narrowing to icy slits as he fixed Maya with a belittling stare. "Let me guess," he drawled with biting sarcasm. "You're going to tell this court that you're some kind of undercover spy, right? Perhaps a secret agent." His smile widened mockingly, displaying his teeth in a wolfish grin. "Maybe even a superhero?" Another round of cold laughter erupted across the courtroom, cruel and callous, washing over Maya like an icy wave. The prosecutor, Todd Graves, barely hid his smirk behind a hand, clearly amused by Mercer's ridicule. Even the jurors shifted, some avoiding her eyes, others openly chuckling. Yet Maya Jennings did not tremble. She did not flinch, did not break her steely composure under the humiliation Mercer had just heaped upon her. Instead, she stood firm, unwavering, unbroken, allowing the laughter to fade until silence returned, heavy and uncomfortable, as if the entire courtroom sensed that a dangerous line had just been crossed. When the room settled again, Maya's lips slowly curled into an enigmatic, icy smile. Her eyes sparkled coldly, dark and fearless, a gaze so intense it seemed to challenge Mercer's authority itself. The judge, momentarily unnerved, straightened in his chair, but stubbornly held his contemptuous sneer. He was irritated now, irritated by her dignity, by her refusal to crumble beneath his ridicule. Maya's voice, when she spoke again, became dangerously quiet, a velvet-covered blade ready to strike. "Interesting," she murmured softly, her words reaching every ear despite their quietness. "That a judge in a position of such great power should find racism entertaining. Interesting that when confronted with injustice, the reaction of this court is laughter, mockery, not concern, not investigation, not fairness. Interesting, Your Honor, that you've already condemned me before I had the chance to utter a single sentence of explanation. Her tone hardened abruptly, each syllable striking like a hammer against iron. Do you know why I refused to present my identification? It wasn't arrogance nor defiance. It was the simple fact that your officers refused to let me speak. They never asked, they demanded, they judged, they condemned. Because people who look like me don't get asked politely, do they? We get commands, we get suspicion, we get cuffs, bruises, humiliation, and then we get laughter from men like you. Mercer's face twisted slightly, no longer smiling, sensing the room's shifting mood. Yet he refused to retreat. His pride hardened into stubbornness. Miss Jennings, he growled impatiently, I will warn you just once. Baseless accusations and melodramatic speeches do not change the fact that you broke the law. Baseless? Maya repeated coldly, eyes flashing dangerously. You call my words baseless, but you've made your judgment clear already. You stand ready to condemn without even asking a single question? Tell me, Your Honor, what exactly are you afraid to hear? Mercer's eyes widened briefly in irritation. Careful, he warned harshly. I won't tolerate threats in my courtroom. Neither will I, Maya responded instantly, her words slicing through the air, perfectly measured and chillingly calm. Threats disguised as law, prejudice hidden behind a badge, injustice camouflaged beneath authority. None of these will silence me. You laugh because you believe someone like me could never be in the right. You laugh because a woman like me doesn't deserve to be heard. That laughter reveals more truth than any document or badge ever could. The entire courtroom had gone deathly quiet, hanging on her every word, tension crackling like electricity in the air. Mercer's arrogance had been shaken, though his pride forbade him to show it openly. You mockingly asked if I was a secret agent, Maya continued, her voice now low and deliberate. But it wouldn't matter if I were the president herself. You wouldn't see me differently, would you? You wouldn't respect me, because respect, to men like you, isn't earned. It's granted based solely on appearances. To you, I'm just another black woman who dares to stand tall. Mercer leaned forward abruptly, eyes glittering dangerously. I've heard enough. Spare us your dramatics. Maya's eyes blazed fiercely, her voice quiet yet burning with conviction. You've heard nothing yet. You may wear a robe, wield a gavel, and command this courtroom, but justice is not yours to mock or manipulate. Justice is a truth you cannot erase with laughter. Mercer's jaw clenched tightly. Maya allowed herself a final unflinching gaze into the judge's cold, bitter eyes, unafraid and unbroken. You laugh because you're confident no one here will challenge you, she said finally, her voice filled with quiet certainty. But you've underestimated one important thing. Truth doesn't remain silent forever, and today it will speak louder than your arrogance, louder than your prejudice. Her words reverberated powerfully, echoing long after she fell silent. Mercer glared at her, furious yet suddenly uncertain. The smirk wiped from his face. Maya Jennings had turned his ridicule into something stronger, a warning. She stood there calmly, untouched by his cruelty, her dignity untarnished, waiting patiently for justice. She knew the truth was on her side, and it would soon make itself known. Until then, she would stand firm, no matter how loudly they laughed. With a deliberate calmness that held everyone's attention hostage, Maya slowly reached inside her blazer pocket, moving cautiously yet purposefully. The bailiffs at each corner of the courtroom instinctively stiffened, hands inching toward their holsters as the tension in the air thickened instantly. The spectators leaned forward, eyes narrowed in curiosity and apprehension, unable to look away. Even Judge Mercer paused, a flicker of unease briefly disrupting his confident facade. Maya withdrew her hand, revealing a small, polished black leather wallet, slim and discreet, yet somehow formidable in her steady grasp. She let the courtroom's collective breath catch for just an instant before flipping the wallet open with calculated precision, holding it high and unmistakably clear for every eye to see. A collective gasp ripped through the gallery. The prosecutor's eyes widened in shock, the smirk melting rapidly from his lips. Judge Mercer's face paled visibly, his previously arrogant posture deflating like a punctured balloon. Clearly etched in gold on the shining badge inside the wallet were the unmistakable words, United States Secret Service, USSS. The badge glinted fiercely under the sterile fluorescent courtroom lights, casting a sharp reflection across the stunned faces of jurors and spectators alike. No one dared move. No one even dared breathe. In a single decisive moment, the tables had turned so drastically that it felt as though the ground itself had shifted. Maya's voice, when she finally spoke again, shattered the oppressive silence like glass striking marble. "My name is Special Agent Maya Jennings," she declared, her tone firm and commanding, resonating powerfully through every corner of the courtroom. Each word was measured and intentional, carrying unmistakable authority and an undeniable weight of truth. "I am a federal agent assigned to the United States Secret Service, and you," she paused, her gaze cutting directly toward Judge Mercer and Prosecutor Graves with piercing intensity, "have arrested the wrong person." The room froze completely. Even the courtroom clock seemed to halt its ticking, as though afraid to disrupt this seismic revelation. Mercer, previously arrogant and self-assured, appeared suddenly small and vulnerable, gripping his gavel tightly in white-knuckled disbelief. Graves fumbled with his documents, now useless in the face of the overwhelming truth that had just been unleashed. Before they could respond, before they could even comprehend the magnitude of their error, Maya calmly reached into a second, larger envelope tucked carefully under the documents on her table. Slowly, deliberately, she withdrew a thick sealed packet of official paperwork emblazoned with the bold seal of the Department of Justice. "This," she continued relentlessly, holding the envelope aloft for maximum impact, "is an official complaint filed directly by the United States Department of Justice, detailing multiple egregious violations committed by the officers who wrongfully arrested me. Violations that were intentionally overlooked by this very court." She paused again, allowing the weight of her statement to hang in the air, heavier than steel chains. Mercer opened his mouth slightly, clearly attempting to formulate a response, but no sound came out. He sat paralyzed, frozen by a mix of humiliation, confusion, and escalating panic. Maya took a step forward, her voice rising slightly as it filled the courtroom with steely determination. "This document outlines the explicit racial profiling, illegal detention, refusal of due process, and intentional mishandling of evidence by federal officers. Officers sworn to uphold the law, officers trusted to protect civil rights, yet who deliberately chose to violate mine simply because of my appearance." Her words cut with surgical precision. Each syllable landed powerfully, stripping bare the injustices she had endured. The jury members exchanged glances, suddenly ashamed and deeply unsettled. Many looked away in embarrassment, realizing how quickly they had judged, how readily they had accepted the distorted narrative presented against her. But Maya wasn't finished. She stepped closer still, her gaze locked onto Judge Mercer with cold fury, forcing him to meet her eyes. "Your Honor, you laughed at me when I told you that racism had played a role here. You mocked the idea that someone like me could possibly hold any position of power, any credibility. Yet here I stand, a sworn federal agent, disrespected, detained, and publicly humiliated without a shred of valid evidence." She carefully placed the sealed DOJ file onto the table in front of her, tapping it gently yet meaningfully. "This document isn't merely a complaint, Your Honor. It is a formal indictment of the prejudice, incompetence, and systemic abuse that this courtroom allowed and encouraged. It holds you and everyone involved accountable, not only to me but to the fundamental principles of justice you swore an oath to protect." Her words echoed fiercely, ricocheting like bullets off the walls, penetrating every conscience present. Mercer's face turned crimson now, a flush of embarrassment mingled dangerously with raw anger, his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles visibly pulsed beneath his aging skin. He had no clever comeback this time, no smug retort to diminish the force of her accusations. The prosecutor, Graves, sank quietly back into his seat, defeated and embarrassed, fumbling awkwardly with his meaningless notes, his arrogance entirely evaporated. The gallery sat frozen, shocked into silence. The palpable tension stretched to breaking point. Yet Maya Jennings stood unbroken, her posture powerful and dignified, her eyes blazing with righteous fury, tempered by steely resolve. She had dismantled their prejudices, exposed their hypocrisy, and laid bare the ugly heart of their so-called justice. Every bruise she bore on her wrists, every mocking laugh, every dismissive glance, she returned now with unflinching strength and unwavering dignity. For a long, suspended moment, nobody spoke. Nobody could. Maya allowed the silence to remain, letting the weight of her words settle deeply into every consciousness present. She stood unmoving, a living symbol of truth, confronting the ugly face of injustice. Finally, she spoke again, this time softer, yet no less powerful. You wanted to know who I am, Your Honor? I am someone who will no longer allow this kind of injustice to pass unnoticed. You arrested the wrong woman today, not because of my badge, but because you presumed to judge me before you ever knew me. Her gaze remained steady, defiant yet calm, as she slowly lowered herself back into her chair, her expression unyielding and confident. The courtroom remained paralyzed, suspended in stunned silence, each heartbeat a deafening reminder of the truth they'd all tried so desperately to ignore. In the end, Maya had delivered a powerful, undeniable message, one that would echo long after the courtroom emptied, long after Mercer's arrogant laughter faded away. Truth would always rise, stronger than ignorance, stronger than prejudice. And today, Maya Jennings was that truth. The silence in the courtroom stretched on painfully, each passing second heavy and oppressive. Judge Ronald Mercer sat frozen on his elevated bench, his jaw working silently, his lips moving without producing coherent words. The room's sudden shift had knocked him off balance, and his previous arrogant authority had been completely drained away. His face, usually a mask of cold, commanding superiority, was now flushed red, his eyes darting frantically between the badge Maya Jennings had presented and the stark, unmistakable seal on the official DOJ complaint. Mercer's throat bobbed nervously as he swallowed hard. Struggling to find words that wouldn't betray his panic, he cleared his throat loudly, breaking the silence in a hoarse, awkward sound that echoed uncomfortably throughout the courtroom. Miss Jennings, he stammered, voice trembling slightly, desperately trying to reestablish control. This is highly irregular. You should have disclosed this earlier. But Maya's sharp voice sliced through his stumbling attempt to shift blame, her tone fierce and resolute. Her words were delivered with laser-like precision, each syllable heavy with accusation, each sentence an indictment of its own. No, Your Honor, Maya retorted sharply, eyes blazing with quiet intensity. I did attempt to explain who I was, but no one wanted to listen. Your officers didn't let me speak. You yourself refused to hear a single word of explanation before passing your judgment. You chose mockery over justice, laughter over fairness, prejudice over truth. Mercer visibly recoiled from her words, attempting to interrupt with a feeble wave of his hand. Miss Jennings, I assure you. No, you assure me nothing, Maya interjected firmly, stepping forward now, every eye glued to her commanding presence. Her voice rose, clear and penetrating, as her eyes bore into the judge with fierce conviction. You judged me the moment I walked through those doors. You saw the color of my skin, and that was enough evidence for you. You had already decided I was guilty. Before you heard a single fact, before reviewing even one piece of evidence, you'd labeled me a criminal. Maya's words reverberated throughout the courtroom, striking at the very heart of the injustice everyone had silently witnessed but chosen to ignore. Mercer shrank back in his chair, his gavel slipping nervously from his grasp and clattering against the polished surface of his bench. The sound startled him, deepening his humiliation as he scrambled clumsily to retrieve it. Maya didn't relent. Taking another deliberate step forward, her gaze locked onto Mercer's trembling form, mercilessly exposing his bias to everyone present. Tell me, Your Honor, did you even pause for one moment to consider why a professional woman with no criminal record would suddenly break federal laws? Did it ever occur to you to question the officer's narrative, to verify their claims? to hear my side of the story?" Mercer opened his mouth again, but no words came out. His authority had utterly dissolved, his confidence shattered, replaced by panic-stricken embarrassment. The entire courtroom watched in stunned silence as the judge, who moments ago had mocked and demeaned Maya, now struggled pitifully to form a single coherent sentence. Maya's voice softened slightly, yet remained dangerously calm, cutting deeper with each carefully chosen word. "You accuse me of arrogance, yet you sit there, presiding over a system so deeply flawed that the truth itself seems irrelevant to you. You mocked my claim of racism because admitting it might mean confronting your own bias. But the truth remains undeniable. You judge me purely because of how I look, without bothering to confirm who I am." She paused briefly, allowing her words to penetrate deeply, her gaze sweeping slowly across the jury and gallery, forcing them all to reflect on their own complicity in what had occurred. Faces shifted uncomfortably. Jurors stared shamefully down at their hands, unable to meet her penetrating eyes. Even the prosecutor, Todd Graves, remained frozen, his expression twisted in embarrassment, suddenly aware of the irreversible damage his silence had caused. Maya turned her gaze back to Mercer, who now looked thoroughly defeated, shrinking under her relentless scrutiny. Justice demands impartiality, fairness, and truth. Yet today, under your supervision, justice was distorted, ignored, and betrayed. The bruises on my wrists, these aren't just physical injuries. They're symbols of a system that abuses its power, a system that considers people like me disposable, unworthy of dignity or respect. Her voice dropped slightly, trembling now with the weight of emotion she could no longer fully contain, though she remained defiantly composed. "You humiliated me, publicly accused me, and presumed guilt before giving me any chance at defense, simply because you could. But now the truth confronts you directly, undeniable and clear, and you have nowhere left to hide." Mercer tried once more, desperately attempting to salvage his crumbling dignity. "Miss Jennings," he managed weakly, "the court had no knowledge," but Maya's fierce voice silenced him instantly. "You had no knowledge because you chose ignorance. You had no facts because you preferred assumption. Your ignorance is not innocence, Your Honor. It's complicity." Her words hung heavily in the air, powerful and resonant, challenging the conscience of everyone present. Mercer finally slumped back into his chair, speechless, utterly defeated, his pale, stricken face now the portrait of complete humiliation. His authority shattered, his arrogance dismantled by Maya's unyielding confrontation. The courtroom remained deathly silent, the tension so intense it felt almost unbearable. Maya stood unshaken, proud and dignified despite every injustice heaped upon her, her quiet strength radiating powerfully. She had transformed from accused to accuser, from victim to avenger, not through violence or anger, but through truth itself, wielded fearlessly in the face of cruelty. Mercer could only sit helplessly, unable to respond, crushed under the weight of the undeniable accusations. Maya Jennings had laid bare the ugly reality of prejudice hiding behind his judicial robe, exposing it to everyone present. There was no denying it now, no mocking laughter left to shield Mercer from accountability. Maya's eyes finally softened, compassion mingling with determination as she spoke her final words in that electrifying moment, quiet yet devastating in their impact. "Today you learned that justice isn't blind. People like you simply choose not to see. But I promise, Judge Mercer, you and everyone here will see clearly now, and you will remember." As her words faded, Maya stood resolutely, unyielding in the silence that followed. She had made her stand, spoken her truth, and forced them all, judge, jury, spectators, to finally confront their complicity in the injustice they had witnessed. Her courage had revealed not only the flaws within the system, but had also challenged them to question their own prejudices and choices. In the end, Maya Jennings had not merely defended herself. She had delivered justice. In the suffocating silence of the courtroom, Prosecutor Todd Graves slowly rose from his seat, clearly shaken, his confidence demolished by the crushing weight of Maya Jennings' revelations. His once authoritative voice now emerged hesitant, awkwardly conciliatory, as if hoping mere words could undo the damage already done. Your Honor, Graves began cautiously, his voice barely above a whisper, given the unexpected evidence presented today, the prosecution formally requests that all charges against Special Agent Maya Jennings be dismissed immediately. He offered Maya an apologetic glance, clearly hoping his simple request would appease her, that it would silence the outrage simmering palpably beneath her carefully maintained composure. Graves appeared desperate to escape further humiliation, ready to bury the entire case beneath procedural jargon and hastily scribbled signatures. Judge Mercer, visibly relieved, nodded eagerly, reaching quickly for his gavel, ready to strike it down, to erase this disastrous embarrassment as swiftly as possible. But before the hammer could connect, before he could conveniently sweep away the injustice that had filled every agonizing moment inside that courtroom, Maya's voice surged forward once more, ringing sharply through the stunned silence like a bullet fired into still water. No! Her single fierce word stopped Mercer's hand midair, freezing every movement in the room. The judge stared, wide-eyed, startled by her defiant interruption. Maya stepped forward, each deliberate step echoing with raw intensity against the polished courtroom floor. Her eyes blazed with a controlled fury that pinned Mercer and Graves in place, daring them to attempt escape from the consequences of their actions. Her voice shook slightly, not from fear or weakness, but from sheer rage at the casual injustice she had been expected to silently endure. You think dismissing these charges is enough? Maya demanded, voice sharp as a blade, slicing through any remnants of false courtesy. You think an apology, a quick dismissal, erases the humiliation I've endured here today? You think it cancels out the racial profiling, the unlawful arrest, the bruises left by your officer's handcuffs? Graves sank slowly back into his chair, color draining rapidly from his face as he realized his attempt at placation had catastrophically failed. Mercer's hand trembled slightly, the gavel forgotten now, his mouth moving silently, unable to produce words. Maya's gaze swept across the courtroom, searing each spectator with an intense stare that exposed their shared guilt. The silent complicity that allowed such blatant injustice to flourish. She would not allow them the comfort of escaping accountability so easily. I don't need forgiveness from you, she declared fiercely, her voice echoing powerfully off the walls, ringing clearly in every guilty conscience present. I don't need your empty dismissal, your convenient excuses, or your cowardly avoidance of responsibility. What I need, what every victim of this system needs, is justice. The fight for justice is just beginning. More shocking twists are ahead. Don't miss a moment. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to stay with us. Thank you for standing for truth and justice. Where are you watching from? Let us know. Maya turned slowly, deliberately, letting her gaze sweep across the packed courtroom like a spotlight exposing every hidden shame. Her eyes, blazing with righteous fury, met each person's stare directly, forcing them to confront the truth they'd ignored so comfortably. Silence settled heavily, stifling, as if the room itself held its breath, afraid of what she might reveal next. You all sat here, she began, her voice low but fierce, trembling slightly with the intensity of her controlled anger, watching silently as I was dragged into this courtroom like a common criminal. You watched as they humiliated me, mocked me openly, laughed at me simply because of who I am. She paused, allowing her accusation to linger painfully, uncomfortably in the air, every listener frozen beneath the weight of their complicity. The jurors shifted uneasily, glancing downward in shame. The spectators avoided her penetrating gaze, aware of their role in the injustice that unfolded before them. Even Judge Mercer remained silent, his earlier bravado stripped away, replaced by profound discomfort. Not one of you spoke up, Maya continued bitterly, voice sharper now, each word striking the silence like a hammer against steel. Not one person questioned the accusations, the brutality, the humiliation inflicted upon me. Because it didn't surprise you, did it? It didn't disturb you enough to intervene. Because you've seen it all before. You've grown comfortable with injustice. You've become accustomed to watching people like me treated this way, so accustomed you no longer recognize how deeply wrong it truly is. The courtroom remained deathly silent, each breath a guilty whisper. Maya moved slowly, deliberately, stepping forward into the very heart of that collective shame. Her presence felt immense, powerful, a living indictment of the broken system they had passively upheld. "Do you think I'm the first?" she challenged fiercely, eyes glistening with emotion, but refusing to shed tears. Her voice grew louder, echoing off the walls, each word a passionate cry demanding recognition. "How many others stood here before me, humiliated, falsely accused, silenced by prejudice, while you simply looked away? How many others suffered quietly beneath your indifferent gaze because you didn't have the courage to confront injustice when it stared you in the face?" Her voice cracked slightly, but she steadied herself immediately, unwilling to let her anger waver, her strength falter. Maya's fists clenched tightly at her sides, the bruises on her wrists throbbing painfully, reminding her vividly of the physical manifestation of the injustice she had endured. "Every person who sat here silently today," she declared firmly, eyes blazing fiercely, "every single one of you shares responsibility for what happened in this courtroom. Your silence enables cruelty. Your indifference empowers prejudice. Your inaction makes injustice routine." Mercer shifted uneasily on his seat, attempting weakly to interject. "Miss Jennings," but Maya silenced him with a swift, sharp motion of her hand, her voice cutting across his feeble protest with absolute authority. "You've had your say, Judge. Now you will listen." Mercer fell silent again, visibly shrinking back into his seat, powerless against her unwavering resolve. "I stand here today," Maya continued, voice slightly softer but filled with steely determination, "not merely as one woman demanding justice for herself, but as a voice for countless others whose cries have gone unanswered, whose dignity has been trampled by your comfortable silence. I will not allow myself to be just another forgotten victim, another story buried beneath bureaucracy and prejudice." She took another determined step forward, shoulders squared, head held high, an image of dignity and defiance. Her eyes shone with fiery resolve, challenging every person present to confront their complicity, their cowardice. "I am not the first to endure this humiliation," she repeated firmly, her voice resonating powerfully through every heart present. "But mark my words, I will fight to ensure I am the last. Your silence ends today. Your complicity ends here. Justice must be served, not just for me, but for everyone you chose to ignore before me." She paused, allowing her words to settle into their consciousness, heavy and inescapable, a demand impossible to ignore. Because if not now, then when? The thick, stifling tension that hung over the courtroom suddenly shattered as the heavy wooden doors swung open with such force they crashed against the walls, sending echoes reverberating sharply through the shocked silence. Heads turned swiftly, the spectators jolting upright, startled eyes searching for the source of this abrupt disruption. The bailiffs instinctively stepped forward, hands darting to their belts, uncertain if they needed to act. Even Maya Jennings, standing resolute and composed in the storm's eye, shifted her gaze toward the doorway, sensing a new and unexpected twist had just arrived. A tall, authoritative figure strode purposefully into the courtroom, his polished shoes striking sharply against the marble floor, each decisive step echoing ominously. He wore a crisply tailored charcoal gray suit, bearing the unmistakable air of federal authority. In his right hand, he clutched a large official-looking envelope bearing the unmistakable seal of the United States Department of Justice. His steely eyes, fixed directly forward, betrayed no hesitation, no doubt, only an ironclad sense of purpose. Judge Ronald Mercer, already shaken, suddenly appeared even paler, his hands trembling visibly atop his polished wooden bench. The arrogant veneer of his authority, already fractured by Maya's revelations, now shattered completely. The previously arrogant judge, who had gleefully mocked and humiliated Maya moments before, now seemed diminished, a shadow of his earlier intimidating presence. The special envoy halted directly in front of Mercer's bench, raising his voice clearly and powerfully, addressing Mercer with unwavering authority. "Judge Ronald Mercer," he declared sharply, his voice resonating clearly through the stunned courtroom, I am Special Investigator Nathaniel Blake, appointed by the U.S. Department of Justice Office of Professional Responsibility. Mercer swallowed hard, panic flickering wildly across his eyes. What? What's the meaning of this? He stammered weakly, voice cracking in a desperate bid to reclaim authority, though his hands continued trembling uncontrollably. Investigator Blake didn't blink, didn't hesitate. Instead, he held the official document aloft, allowing everyone to clearly see the stark DOJ insignia emblazoned boldly across its surface. By direct order from the Department of Justice, he continued in an unwavering, commanding voice, you are hereby placed under immediate investigation for severe judicial misconduct, abuse of power, systemic racial discrimination, and violations of ethical standards governing your judicial conduct. The room erupted into stunned whispers, shocked murmurs rippling swiftly through the gallery. Jurors glanced anxiously at each other, mouths agape. Even Todd Graves, the previously confident prosecutor, now shrank back into his seat, distancing himself desperately from Mercer's crumbling authority. No, this is impossible, Mercer protested frantically, shaking his head in denial, his desperate eyes darting wildly around the courtroom, searching fruitlessly for allies. But his gaze was met only with cold indifference. Faces quickly turned away from him, unwilling to share in his disgrace. Investigator Blake stepped closer still, holding the envelope out firmly toward Mercer, unyielding, relentless in his official duty. This investigation, he declared firmly, voice ringing with an unmistakable note of justice finally served, follows credible and detailed evidence provided by Special Agent Maya Jennings, evidence that clearly establishes your direct role in enabling and perpetuating discriminatory practices and unlawful abuses of authority within this courtroom. Mercer's breath quickened noticeably, his eyes widening in horror. The document, still held out by Investigator Blake, hovered in the space between them, an inescapable symbol of the justice Mercer had long evaded. Slowly, his trembling hand reached forward, accepting the envelope reluctantly, fingers shaking violently. You cannot do this, Mercer muttered desperately, his voice barely audible. I have served this court for decades. Blake interrupted him with brutal efficiency. Your decades of service do not excuse your abuse of power or blatant prejudice. Justice demands accountability, Judge Mercer, not protection for those who betray its trust. Mercer's head snapped upward, eyes frantic with fear and anger, voice rising desperately. This woman, he gestured wildly at Maya, has twisted the truth. She's manipulated you all. Maya's voice, calm yet cutting, swiftly silenced his outburst. I manipulated nothing, Your Honor. I exposed the truth you believed you could hide beneath arrogance and intimidation. Justice is blind, but it is not ignorant. It sees you clearly. Mercer slumped back into his seat, utterly defeated, his bravado evaporating under the relentless weight of truth. Investigator Blake nodded firmly toward Maya, a quiet acknowledgement of her courage, before turning back to Mercer, his voice unyielding. Effective immediately, you are suspended from judicial duties, pending a full and thorough investigation. Officers, he commanded sharply, signaling 2 federal agents waiting just inside the doorway. Escort Judge Mercer from this courtroom immediately. Mercer sprang to his feet desperately, eyes wild with panic, voice strained with disbelief. You can't remove me like this. I demand representation. Blake responded evenly, unperturbed. You'll receive full representation according to the law. Rights you systematically denied those who stood before you, like Special Agent Jennings. Your position offers no immunity from justice. The agents moved swiftly forward, gripping Mercer firmly by his trembling arms, guiding him carefully but forcefully away from his towering bench, the seat of power he had so flagrantly abused. Mercer struggled weakly, shouting futilely, his voice trailing away as they guided him toward the courtroom's exit. The spectators, now silent, watched wide-eyed, witnessing the fall of a man who had seemed untouchable mere moments before. As Mercer's protests faded, Investigator Blake turned toward Maya once more, his expression composed yet respectful, voice steady and sincere. Agent Jennings, he addressed her directly, clearly audible to every ear present. The Department of Justice formally extends its deepest apology for the unlawful treatment you endured. Your bravery in confronting this injustice has uncovered systemic corruption, and we assure you, we will hold those responsible fully accountable. Maya stood silently for a moment, processing the gravity of what had just transpired, her heart still pounding from the adrenaline of confronting Mercer's prejudice head-on. Her voice, when she finally spoke, emerged quietly but powerfully determined. "I accept the apology," she replied calmly, nodding respectfully toward Investigator Blake. "But apologies alone aren't enough. Real justice requires change. It demands accountability, transparency, and relentless vigilance against abuses like the one this courtroom witnessed today." Investigator Blake nodded solemnly, acknowledging the undeniable truth of her words. "Agreed," he affirmed resolutely, "and the actions taken here today are just the beginning. This investigation will send a clear message nationwide. No judge, no courtroom, no institution stands above justice." Maya glanced around the courtroom one final time, observing the shaken faces, the humbled posture of Todd Graves, the empty, abandoned judge's bench now stripped of its unjust authority. She saw clearly in each set of eyes a new understanding, a painful awareness of complicity, a recognition of injustice long overlooked. "Then let that message be clear," she declared firmly, her voice strong, unwavering, filled with the quiet power of hard-earned victory. "Let no judge believe himself above the law. Let no person suffer silently again in the shadow of prejudice. Today we've shown justice isn't just a promise, it's a duty. And from this moment forward, none of us can claim ignorance. Justice will demand that we all stand up, speak out, and hold those in power accountable." Maya Jennings took a steadying breath as she stepped out from the heavy oak doors of the courthouse, the brilliant sunlight immediately piercing through the oppressive shadows that had clung so relentlessly to her throughout the trial. She blinked against the sudden brightness, the warm rays caressing her skin like an embrace of long-awaited freedom. Yet, even as she emerged into daylight, she felt the lingering echoes of injustice. The bruises on her wrists still burned beneath the crisp fabric of her navy suit, and the harsh, mocking laughter of Judge Mercer still reverberated faintly in her ears. But now Maya stood tall, her posture unyielding, her presence radiating a quiet yet fierce dignity. As she descended the courthouse steps, her polished heels clicking rhythmically on the stone surface, the silent awe of those gathered outside shifted quickly into a crescendo of excited murmurs. Cameras flashed, shutters clicked furiously, and reporters surged forward, their microphones thrust eagerly towards her. Journalists shouted questions over each other, voices mixing chaotically as they sought a reaction, a quote, an exclusive snippet of her extraordinary story. "Maya, Agent Jennings!" one journalist shouted urgently, pushing her way through the throng, eyes bright with intensity. "How does it feel to have your charges dismissed?" Another reporter jumped forward, almost stumbling in her enthusiasm. "Were you surprised by Judge Mercer's behavior? Did you expect such blatant discrimination?" A third voice broke through sharply, demanding attention above the rest. "Do you think your case signals a broader issue of racism within the justice system?" Maya paused at the base of the courthouse steps, the weight of every question settling around her like the press of an ocean wave, powerful, overwhelming, impossible to ignore. Yet instead of shrinking beneath the intensity, she raised her hand calmly, silencing the frenzied crowd instantly with the sheer quiet authority of her gesture. Her gaze swept deliberately across the faces surrounding her, reading the mix of curiosity, admiration, confusion, and in some cases, lingering skepticism. When Maya finally spoke, her voice was clear and powerful, resonating deeply and unmistakably sincere. "How do I feel?" she echoed thoughtfully, allowing the words to hang deliberately in the silence, heavy with significance. "I feel relieved, yes, but this isn't simply about me or my personal vindication. This moment is about justice itself, justice that should never have been denied or delayed. What happened to me in that courtroom was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom, a painful, undeniable reflection of a system that has tolerated prejudice for far too long." Her voice grew stronger with every sentence. words ringing passionately into the afternoon air, each syllable a fierce, determined strike against the complacency of ignorance. Judge Mercer laughed at me today. He mocked me, ridiculed me openly, not because of anything I'd done, but because of assumptions he had already made. He laughed simply because he thought he knew me. But he didn't. She paused, eyes flashing with a fierce intensity that sent a shiver through the assembled crowd. Never laugh at someone you know nothing about, Maya declared firmly, her voice echoing powerfully, resonating far beyond the immediate circle of reporters. Because that laughter, your ridicule, your contempt, may be silencing a voice you desperately need to hear, a truth that might just change your understanding of the world. She moved her gaze slowly, deliberately across the faces of the reporters and cameras, ensuring her words penetrated deeply, settling uncomfortably within their consciousness. Today, I stood in a courtroom, accused of crimes I did not commit, treated like a criminal simply because I dared to exist as a black woman confident in her own innocence. I was mocked, humiliated, disbelieved, not because evidence supported that treatment, but because prejudice allowed it. Her voice became quieter, yet more intensely passionate, emotion trembling just beneath the surface as she spoke. I was silenced today, or at least that's what they tried to do. They hoped their laughter would erase my dignity, that their ridicule would bury my voice. But they underestimated one critical thing. Silence is not weakness. She stepped closer to the cameras, her eyes shining brilliantly, defiantly, as the weight of her message filled every space, every breath, every heartbeat of those present. Silence is survival. Silence is strength. Silence is waiting patiently, courageously, for the moment when speaking becomes a necessity, when truth demands a voice loud enough to shatter ignorance, arrogance, and prejudice. Her gaze locked fiercely onto a camera lens directly ahead, addressing not only those gathered before her, but a nation watching beyond. "We will not be silent anymore," she declared firmly, voice swelling powerfully, each word charged with conviction. "Today marks an end, a definitive end, to tolerating injustice quietly, accepting humiliation passively, or excusing prejudice conveniently. From this moment forward, silence becomes action, action becomes change. Justice demands nothing less." The crowd around her erupted spontaneously into applause, a powerful wave of admiration, agreement, and passionate acknowledgement of her bravery, her defiance, her unwavering commitment to truth. Maya stood quietly, allowing the applause to wash over her, though her face remained solemn, deeply aware of the enormity of the battle still ahead. When the applause finally subsided, one young journalist stepped forward nervously, eyes earnest, voice trembling slightly with genuine emotion. "Special Agent Jennings, what would you say to others who might face similar injustices but don't have the same platform or authority you have?" Maya's expression softened visibly, compassion filling her eyes even as her voice remained powerfully determined. "I would tell them exactly what I needed to hear myself today," she replied gently but firmly. "You are not alone. Your struggle, your pain, your silence, it is heard, felt, and shared. Our voices joined together can no longer be ignored or silenced. Justice requires courage, and that courage exists in each of us, waiting for the right moment to emerge." She paused briefly, allowing her message to settle deeply into the consciousness of every person listening, both present and distant. To those facing injustice, discrimination, or humiliation, remember this: you are stronger than those who mock you. Your dignity cannot be taken from you unless you surrender it. And even if you must remain silent for a time, your silence is never weakness. It is the quiet preparation for a voice powerful enough to shake the very foundations of injustice. Maya straightened her posture, turning finally toward the bustling city streets, prepared now to continue forward, aware her words and actions today had ignited something far greater than herself. The cameras continued flashing, journalists still calling questions, but Maya moved confidently through the throng, leaving behind the courthouse and its shadows of prejudice and humiliation, stepping instead into the powerful, unyielding light of justice renewed. Her story had become more than a simple personal victory. It was now a call to action, a declaration of resilience, a symbol of hope for every individual silenced by prejudice and injustice. Maya Jennings was no longer merely a survivor of discrimination. She had become a living emblem of courage, defiance, and relentless pursuit of truth. As she stepped toward her car, one final journalist called out loudly, passionately, voice trembling with genuine admiration and respect. "Maya, Special Agent Jennings, what do you hope people remember from your experience today?" She paused, turning back one final time, her eyes fierce yet compassionate, her voice steady, powerful, and resolutely clear. "Remember this," she replied firmly, each word resonating deeply within every listener's heart. "Never underestimate the strength hidden within silence. Never ignore injustice simply because it doesn't affect you directly, and never laugh at someone whose truth you have not yet heard. Justice may be delayed, obstructed, even denied temporarily, but it will always, always rise. And today, we have proven exactly that." With those powerful final words lingering strongly in the air, Maya turned decisively away, stepping forward into the brilliant sunlight, prepared for the battles ahead, confident in her strength, her voice, and the unshakable truth she now carried. Behind her, the courthouse stood silently, forever changed by her courage and resilience, a solemn witness to the power of truth bravely spoken and justice finally served. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. Maya Jennings' journey was far more than a gripping courtroom drama. It was a profound testament to the painful reality of prejudice and the enduring strength of truth. Her story was not merely about one woman's fight for personal justice. It illuminated a chillingly familiar darkness within society itself. The bruises etched deeply around her wrists were symbolic wounds, reminders of how quickly dignity could be stripped away by ignorance masked as authority. Each dismissive glare from Judge Mercer, each mocking chuckle from Prosecutor Graves, each cold glance from the indifferent spectators echoed the disturbing ease with which injustice flourishes when good people choose silence over courage. Yet beneath the courtroom's oppressive silence, Maya's quiet resolve radiated powerfully, illuminating the stark contrast between truth and deception, courage and cowardice. Every time Mercer's laughter reverberated through that courtroom, it mocked not just Maya, but the very concept of equality and fairness. Mercer's disdainful smirk and arrogant proclamations had embodied society's ugliest assumptions, that dignity, respect, and innocence could be judged at a glance, determined solely by skin color or appearance. Mercer presumed Maya's guilt not because he knew her actions, but because he had already decided who she was before ever hearing her voice. Maya's defiance, therefore, became more than personal. It transformed into a compelling symbol for countless individuals who'd faced humiliation, discrimination, and ridicule under the facade of justice. Her struggle within that suffocating courtroom exposed not only the prejudices of a single judge, but the systemic failure of a justice system built on dangerous assumptions and deep-rooted biases. As Maya stood confidently before Mercer, refusing to crumble under his ridicule, she embodied an urgent lesson: that courage could exist quietly, resolutely, even within the harshest storms of injustice. But her story taught an even deeper truth: that silence itself, so often mistaken for weakness, could become a source of immense power. Maya had waited, composed and patient, enduring ridicule and contempt, because she understood the strategic necessity of waiting for precisely the right moment. Her eventual voice, clear and forceful, shattered Mercer's carefully constructed illusion of authority, revealing the hidden truth: that real strength doesn't reside in loud, arrogant proclamations, but in unwavering patience, determination, and moral clarity. The lesson in Maya's victory was profound. Never underestimate the quiet strength within those you dismiss or belittle. Mercer's laughter had sought to silence her, to humiliate her into submission, yet it failed utterly, ultimately leading to his own disgrace. Through his downfall, the story revealed a powerful human truth that ignorance, prejudice, and arrogance are self-defeating. They consume themselves from within when confronted by unwavering truth and dignity. The courtroom spectators, too, were crucial reflections of society's complicity and injustice. Their silence had not been neutral, it was enabling. By remaining passive while Maya was dragged into court, humiliated and openly mocked, they became accomplices in perpetuating systemic discrimination. Maya's accusation against them, her fierce, unwavering challenge, served as an uncomfortable yet necessary awakening, a reminder that injustice persists precisely because too many people remain silent witnesses rather than courageous advocates. Maya's story urged an urgent reckoning with the true nature of silence. Silence isn't merely the absence of speech. It is the conscious choice to withhold truth when it matters most. The spectator's silence reinforced injustice, while Maya's strategic silence ultimately amplified her voice when it mattered most. Her declaration, delivered with passionate clarity that silence is not weakness, challenged audiences to reconsider their own complicity, their own silent endorsement of prejudice and discrimination. Moreover, Maya's victory was not simply her personal redemption. It served as a beacon of hope and inspiration for those still trapped in injustice's shadow. The painful, visible marks on her wrists, the emotional scars left by humiliation, and the brutal mockery she endured all underscored a critical truth. Achieving justice is never easy or painless. It demands sacrifice, persistence, and often profound courage. Maya demonstrated that the path to justice is littered with obstacles intended to silence, intimidate, and discourage. But true courage refuses to yield, no matter how powerful the opposition. Her triumph also illuminated a vital societal lesson. Confronting prejudice and systemic injustice requires more than mere acknowledgement. It demands action, accountability, and relentless advocacy. Maya refused the prosecutor's easy offer of dismissal because she understood clearly that true justice means holding the powerful accountable, not merely sweeping injustices quietly away. Accountability, transparency, and unwavering moral courage form the foundation upon which lasting societal change is built. By refusing to quietly accept a mere apology, Maya redefined the meaning of justice itself, transforming it from a passive expectation into an active, persistent demand. Her words, "I don't need forgiveness, I need justice," crystallized an essential moral lesson. True justice involves actively confronting injustice, dismantling prejudice, and holding accountable those who perpetuate harm. Ultimately, Maya's powerful exit from that courthouse, surrounded by journalists and onlookers, signified more than her own personal vindication. It was a powerful, symbolic rebirth of justice itself. When she faced the media, her words resonated deeply. Never laugh at someone you don't understand. This simple yet powerful message encapsulated the very heart of the story, urging empathy, understanding, and the recognition of dignity in every human being. Her cautionary reminder that silence was never synonymous with weakness and that injustice can only survive when voices remain suppressed was a rallying cry. Maya made it clear that silence would no longer be the refuge of injustice. Her voice and her story served as a powerful call to action, compelling each listener to reflect deeply on their own responsibilities toward achieving a fairer society. In the end, Maya Jennings's journey taught that justice, though frequently delayed and often painfully obstructed, can never be permanently silenced. It taught that real strength often resides in quiet dignity, patient endurance, and courageous truth-telling. And it taught, above all, that injustice thrives only when good people choose silence over courage. Maya became more than just a survivor of injustice. She became an emblem of hope, resilience, and moral clarity. Her story reminded everyone that justice demands our active participation, our refusal to remain silent, and our willingness to stand courageously against prejudice wherever it appears. The courtroom that had sought to silence her voice instead amplified it, sending a clear, powerful message to society. Justice, truth, and dignity will always rise, no matter how forcefully injustice attempts to silence them. White judge finds black woman only to learn she's the head of the Bar Association. At 9:07 a.m., The heavy doors of courtroom 3A swung open. All heads turned as Naomi Washington entered, her heels echoing sharply on the marble floor. The room froze. She wasn't just late, she was walking into a storm. Judge Victor Langston, known for his harsh discipline, looked up with a piercing glare. He didn't need a clock. She was 7 minutes late, and everyone knew it. Naomi's navy suit was flawless, her white blouse pristine. She moved with quiet composure, though a bead of sweat slid down her jaw, evidence not of fear, but of the rush to help a desperate single mother avoid eviction just minutes earlier. She had just prevented one injustice. Now she was about to face another. "Miss Washington," Judge Langston barked, rising slightly from his bench. His voice boomed across the courtroom, silencing the soft murmurs and rustling papers. "You are late. 7 minutes late, to be exact. Do you believe this courtroom operates on your schedule?" Naomi opened her mouth, calm and professional, but the judge's gavel struck hard. Once, twice, before she could utter a word. "This is not a forum for your excuses," he snapped. "Do you think you're exempt from the rules because of your reputation?" A hush fell, the kind of hush that signaled everyone knew what was coming, but no one dared to interfere. Naomi straightened her back. Her voice, when it came, was measured, respectful. "Your Honor, I apologize. I was assisting a client in an emergency eviction situation. A single mother." "I did not ask for a story," the judge snapped again, eyes narrowed. "You are in contempt of court for your blatant disregard of procedure. I'm fining you $1,000, effective immediately. This courtroom is not a place for late arrivals and self-righteous monologues." The silence that followed was oppressive. Not a cough, not a shuffle, not even the sound of fingers typing from the court reporter's station. Naomi stood still, absorbing the blow. Her breath remained steady, but her eyes shifted subtly to the left, where her client, a nervous man named Samuel Ortega, sat frozen in disbelief. 7 minutes. 7 minutes of delay after years of service. After hundreds of pro bono cases. After turning down high-paying corporate offers to fight for people who couldn't afford representation. After graduating top of her class from Harvard Law. After building her own legal clinic from scratch in a neglected part of the city. 7 minutes. And she was being publicly humiliated by a man who hadn't even asked why. But Naomi didn't flinch. She didn't beg. She didn't argue. She walked quietly to her seat at the defense table, unfolded her notes with precise movements, and sat beside her client with the elegance of a queen forced to sit among thieves. The opposing counsel, 3 smug men in $1,000 suits, exchanged satisfied smirks. They knew Judge Langston. He liked order. He liked control. And he did not like being challenged, especially by someone like Naomi. Someone black, someone brilliant, someone who had already, in their eyes, climbed too far. Langston's face remained stony as he leaned forward, gavel still in hand, fingers tapping the wood like a ticking bomb. "Let this serve as a reminder to every person in this courtroom," he said coldly. "Punctuality is not optional. Discipline is not negotiable." Naomi glanced up, her eyes unreadable. She had seen injustice wear many masks. Sometimes it came as brute force. Other times it came dressed in a black robe with a nameplate and a gavel. The gallery watched in stiff silence. Law students scribbled notes furiously, unsure if they were witnessing a lesson in law or in cruelty. The older attorneys looked away. No one intervened. No one objected. Because in that courtroom, power didn't belong to the truth. It belonged to the man with the microphone. Naomi exhaled slowly, not in surrender, but in steel-like restraint. She placed a single page from her folder onto the table. The page contained timestamps, emails, and signed legal documents proving that while this courtroom waited in icy silence, she had saved a woman and her child from becoming homeless. But she didn't speak of it, not yet, because Naomi Washington knew battles weren't won by screaming back. They were won by standing tall, by building truth brick by brick, and by surviving long enough to show everyone who underestimated you just how wrong they were. The room's atmosphere remained taut, stretched thin like a wire ready to snap. Judge Langston moved on to call the case. "Ortega versus Cortec Industries," he said without emotion. Miss Washington, are you prepared to proceed despite your morning difficulties? Naomi stood, her hands resting gently on the desk. I am, Your Honor. Her voice was calm, controlled, but beneath that surface lay a quiet fury. Controlled not by weakness, but by discipline forged through years of navigating courtrooms that treated her like a guest in a house she helped build. The gavel struck again, and the trial began. Fine high. The courtroom lights buzzed faintly overhead as the case Ortega versus Cortec Industries officially commenced. Naomi Washington adjusted her blazer and gave a brief, steady nod to her client, Samuel Ortega, a middle-aged man with rough, calloused hands and weary eyes. He was the owner of a small electronics repair shop, modest, family-run, and now teetering on the edge of collapse thanks to a multi-million-dollar lawsuit claiming patent infringement. Across the aisle, the plaintiff's table gleamed. Three high-powered attorneys from Cortex sat confidently, draped in sleek charcoal suits, their expressions as smooth as their rehearsed statements. The lead counsel, Jonathan Maddox, stood and addressed the court with the swagger of someone who knew the terrain favored him. He launched into a long-winded narrative about Cortex's pioneering intellectual property, weaving in complex jargon with deliberate authority. For nearly 20 uninterrupted minutes, he paced, gestured, postured, painting Ortega as a back-alley tinkerer infringing on the sacred domain of corporate innovation. He was never interrupted, not once. Judge Victor Langston, seated high on the bench, listened without reaction, his hands folded calmly. He didn't flinch when Maddox veered into speculation. He didn't object when Maddox subtly insulted Ortega's lack of education or Naomi's emotional tone. He simply let the show play out. When Maddox finally said, "We rest our opening with confidence in our evidence and the strength of our claim," the judge gave a curt nod. Naomi rose slowly. She moved with measured precision, the weight of her silence all morning fueling her calm fire. She placed her hand on a stack of documents and addressed the court with unwavering clarity. Your Honor, the defense will demonstrate that Mr. Ortega's repair methods were developed independently and documented years before Cortex patent filing. Miss Washington, Judge Langston interrupted, his voice slicing through the room. Focus on the relevant points. This is not a classroom. A hush fell over the gallery. Naomi's mouth tightened slightly, but she didn't flinch. Your Honor, this timeline is essential to establishing that. I said focus, Langston snapped, voice louder now. We don't need a lecture. Naomi paused, breathing in deeply. Around her, pens halted mid-stroke. Students, journalists, and junior lawyers looked up, startled. Her presentation hadn't even lasted 60 seconds. The evidence directly disproves the plaintiff's claim of patent infringement, she said, each word clipped but composed. She picked up a technical schematic, the ink still crisp on the page. This repair method was filed, time-stamped, and operational in Mr. Ortega's shop 3 years before Cortex patent. Before she could approach the bench, Maddox rose like clockwork. Objection, Your Honor. This exhibit was not properly disclosed. Naomi turned, her voice calm but firm. Page 47, Exhibit C, submitted 2 months ago. I have the court's delivery receipt and confirmation from opposing counsel's office. Maddox faltered, but Judge Langston didn't even ask to see the document. Instead, he gave Naomi a withering glare. Miss Washington, in my courtroom, we don't argue with counsel. You will maintain decorum. I'm clarifying a factual misstatement, Naomi replied, tone unwavering. Langston leaned forward, eyes narrowing. One more word and I'll strike your exhibit. Naomi looked down at the schematic, then back up, her eyes unblinking. This wasn't her first courtroom, but it might have been the most hostile. The injustice wasn't hidden. It was loud. It was glaring. It wore a robe and sat at the bench. Yet Naomi pressed forward. She introduced the next piece of evidence, carefully linking the components, dates, and workflows that proved Ortega's independence from Cortex technology. Each sentence was a step uphill, every pause, a calculated breath to stay centered against a current trying to pull her under. Langston interrupted her 3 more times in the next 5 minutes. Samuel Ortega sat frozen in his seat, shoulders hunched, fists clenched beneath the table. The courtroom around him blurred, the voices of attorneys and the shuffle of papers fading into a hollow, oppressive silence. He had spent the last 2 years pouring every ounce of his energy and every last cent into keeping his humble electronics repair shop alive. Now, watching the judge dismiss his lawyer's voice with condescension and barely disguised contempt, he felt something crack inside him, not from fear, from recognition. This wasn't justice. This was theater. He looked to his left. Naomi Washington remained composed, her posture straight, her jaw set, her hands steady as she flipped to the next page of her file. Not a flicker of doubt passed over her face. No panic, no frustration, only cold, razor-sharp focus. It was the kind of calm that came from years of fighting uphill battles in courtrooms where the rules weren't applied equally, and from knowing that any slip, any show of emotion, could be used to discredit her. "Your Honor," Naomi began again, lifting another document. "This is a sworn affidavit from the supplier who provided Mr. Ortega with the components used in his repair method in 2015, 2 years prior to Cortex's patent application." Judge Langston didn't even look up. "Noted. Move on." She did, unflinching, controlled. Each sentence she delivered was clear, fact-based, and relevant. But the courtroom's energy was suffocating. Naomi wasn't just arguing a case. She was surviving an ambush. The imbalance of power was stark. Maddox and his co-counsels lounged comfortably across the aisle, occasionally whispering, smirking, knowing full well the judge wasn't scrutinizing their every word. They had walked into this courtroom expecting an easy win, and Langston's behavior had only confirmed their confidence. But Naomi wasn't rattled. She adjusted the microphone slightly and pressed forward. "This blueprint," she continued, "was submitted to the Small Business Registry along with a license application. It contains the exact repair layout Cortex claims to have invented, dated well before their patent filing." She stepped forward, hand outstretched with the exhibit. Langston waved her off without glancing up. "Summarize it. We don't have time for minutia." Naomi held her ground. "The details are not minutia, Your Honor. They are the evidence." Langston's head lifted slowly. A pause stretched like a wire pulled taut. "Do not speak back to the bench, Miss Washington," he said, voice low and icy. A few gasps escaped from the gallery. Even the court reporter hesitated, fingers hovering above the stenograph machine. Samuel leaned toward Naomi, voice barely a whisper. "They're not listening. It doesn't matter what we show them, does it?" Naomi didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on the judge. "It matters," she said under her breath, steady as ever. "It matters because it's true." Then louder, "Your Honor, if I may continue." Langston didn't reply. He simply gestured for her to go on, face unreadable, detached. Naomi turned back to the gallery screen, loading up an enlarged digital image of the repair schematic. "This diagram," she said, pointer in hand, "shows the functional differences between Mr. Ortega's original circuit routing and the one presented by Cortex in their patent. Our expert witness, Dr. Lena Murray, will confirm that the designs are not only independently developed, but functionally distinct." And yet again, Maddox stood. "Objection. This witness wasn't disclosed in the preliminary filings." Before Naomi could respond, Langston cut her off. "We'll determine admissibility later. Sit down, Miss Washington." She did so, calmly, with grace, but fire still burned beneath the surface. Samuel watched her in awe. He had seen lawyers break under far less. He had watched attorneys shrink when judges turned hostile. But Naomi, she absorbed every blow and turned it into fuel. Her calm wasn't submission. It was defiance honed to surgical precision. She wasn't just defending him. She was showing him what it meant to stand when the system tried to make you kneel. In the back row of courtroom 3A, a cluster of law students sat hunched over their notebooks, pens scratching across the pages with urgency. Their professor had encouraged them to observe real-world litigation to better understand courtroom dynamics, but none of them had expected to witness something like this. What was unfolding before them wasn't a trial. It was a slow-motion collision between power and principle, and everyone in the room could feel it. "Why is he treating her like that?" one student whispered, barely moving her lips. "I know, right?" another murmured, eyes flicking between the bench and the defense table. "He didn't say a word when the other guy talked for, like 20 minutes straight." Their attention was locked on Judge Langston, whose clipped tone and constant interruptions had turned Naomi Washington's defense into a battlefield. Every time she tried to present evidence, he cut her off. Every time she clarified a procedural point, he reprimanded her. The pattern was undeniable, and the students were starting to see it for what it was. "This doesn't feel right," someone muttered. "She's literally quoting case law and he's acting like she's wasting time." They had all learned about judicial neutrality in class. They had studied due process, the right to be heard, the sacred structure of fairness that was supposed to govern every American courtroom. But what they saw now defied that ideal. The judge's gavel wasn't maintaining order, it was controlling the narrative. And Naomi Washington was being boxed in, cut down, and pushed aside with a cold efficiency that felt too deliberate to be accidental. Then came the moment that shifted the energy completely. One of the students leaned toward the others, brow furrowed. "Wait, Naomi Washington? That name sounds familiar." There was a pause as the others looked up, curious. "Yeah," someone replied, lowering their pen. "Where have I heard that before?" Another student, flipping quickly through their tablet, typed with shaking fingers. Seconds later, his eyes widened. "Guys," he whispered, his voice suddenly low and electric. "She's the president of the Texas Bar Association." A sharp breath caught in the throat of the girl next to him. "What? Are you serious?" He turned the screen toward them. There on the front page of a legal publication was a professional headshot of Naomi Washington, standing at a podium, mid-speech, her hand raised in emphasis, her eyes fierce and focused. The headline read, "Breaking Barriers, Naomi Washington elected youngest black president in state bar history." The students looked up again, stunned. "She's not just some attorney," someone whispered. "She's her." Silence settled among them like a cold wind. Now every interruption, every dismissive wave of Judge Langston's hand, every time he cut her off or dismissed her argument, it all carried a deeper sting. This wasn't just unprofessional. It was a public dismantling of someone who had spent her career fighting to uplift others. And it wasn't subtle. The students were seeing it in real time, how even the most accomplished black woman in the room was being treated like she didn't belong there. One of the students, a first-generation law candidate, clenched her jaw and looked at Naomi with something like awe. "She's still standing," she whispered. "He's throwing everything at her, and she hasn't flinched once." Another nodded slowly. "That's not weakness. That's power." Naomi, at the center of it all, remained calm. Her voice, though interrupted, never lost its composure. Her hands didn't shake. Her logic remained airtight. But now more than a few people in the room were watching her differently. They weren't just observing a case. They were witnessing history trying to repeat itself, and a woman refusing to let it. Even from the back row, the students could feel it. Naomi Washington wasn't just defending a client. She was teaching everyone in that courtroom, especially the ones who would go on to wear robes of their own, exactly what it meant to fight with truth, dignity, and unbreakable resolve. But while the courtroom simmered with tension and silent outrage, something unexpected was happening just outside. Something that would soon flip the power dynamic on its head. Court clerk Marcus Holloway sat at his desk near the clerk's office, eyes scanning the pages of the Texas Legal Bulletin, barely paying attention at first. His morning had been spent rushing documents to judges, confirming case files, and listening to the muffled, relentless gavel strikes echoing from courtroom 3A. He had noticed Naomi Washington enter earlier, flustered but composed, and he had seen how quickly Judge Langston had turned the atmosphere from formal to hostile. He didn't know Naomi personally, but something about the way she carried herself, even under fire, lingered in his mind like a question left unanswered. And then his eyes landed on the front page of the bulletin. Naomi Washington elected first black woman, president of the Texas Bar Association. Marcus blinked. A chill ran up his spine as he stared at the photo. It was her, no doubt about it. Naomi Washington, Harvard law graduate, civil rights powerhouse, pro bono warrior. Her portrait, dignified and fearless, stared back at him from beneath the headline. She stood behind a podium, hands mid-gesture, delivering what the article called a landmark keynote on judicial accountability. The irony struck him like a slap. He quickly read through the first few paragraphs. It was more than just a ceremonial title. Naomi had spent 2 decades fighting for systemic legal reform. She'd launched clinics for underserved neighborhoods, defended hundreds of indigent clients, written 2 best-selling books on justice reform, and most recently, turned down a nomination for federal judgeship. Not because she wasn't qualified, because she believed her work at the community level still wasn't finished. Marcus swallowed hard. The woman Judge Langston had fined and humiliated in open court for arriving 7 minutes late, without even letting her speak, was arguably the most respected legal mind in the entire state, and no one in that courtroom seemed to realize it. Until now. Marcus stood abruptly, the bulletin clutched in his hand, heart racing. The air around him seemed to still. Every second that passed now felt loaded with consequence. He wasn't supposed to interrupt proceedings. Protocol dictated that he remain neutral, procedural. But what he held in his hand wasn't just a news article. It was the truth, a truth Judge Langston needed to face before the next gavel fell. He waited until the court recessed for lunch. Inside Chamber Room 3, Judge Langston sat alone at his desk, slowly stirring a cup of lukewarm coffee. His brow furrowed as he reviewed case notes, but his mind wasn't on the evidence. It was on Naomi Washington, her presence, her poise, and though he wouldn't yet admit it, the growing realization that his courtroom hadn't been in control that morning. It had been on the edge. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Enter," he called. Marcus stepped inside and closed the door gently behind him. In his hand was the folded Texas Legal Bulletin, marked with a yellow post-it tab. "Your Honor," Marcus said quietly, walking toward the desk. "I think you should see this." Langston raised an eyebrow. "I'm reviewing the file." While Naomi sat alone on the cold wooden bench lining the courthouse hallway, her back straight, shoulders squared, and eyes locked on the documents spread neatly across her lap. The distant hum of vending machines and muffled footsteps echoed through the tiled corridor, but she was focused, utterly, intensely focused. She reviewed technical schematics, scanned through timestamps, cross-referenced affidavits. Her pen moved in deliberate strokes as she annotated margins with notes only she could decipher. To the casual observer, she was calm, collected, in control. But beneath that professional armor, a storm churned. Her jaw tightened every time she replayed the morning in her head. Judge Langston's glare, the interruptions, the public humiliation. 7 minutes late. 7 minutes. That's all it had taken for the court to treat her like a child instead of a seasoned professional. And not once had she been allowed to explain. Not once had the judge paused to ask why. He hadn't cared. None of them had. The corporate attorneys, seated with smug indifference, had smiled as the judge silenced her again and again. Her client, Mr. Ortega, sat stunned, watching the person he'd entrusted with his livelihood be treated like an intruder in her own field. And the courtroom, the place that was supposed to uphold fairness, justice, truth, had offered no protection. Still, Naomi didn't crumble. She couldn't afford to. She had learned long ago that courtrooms weren't built for people like her. Not really. And when the rules bent, they never bent in her favor. So she had become the exception. The storm in a tailored suit. The woman who walked into biased spaces and dared to speak anyway. Now, as she sat beneath the flickering light overhead, flipping to her closing points, she had no idea what was happening behind the courtroom doors. No idea that her name had been on the cover of that morning's Texas Legal Bulletin. No idea that a court clerk had just delivered it to the judge. No idea that her legacy, her decades of work, her sacrifices, her silence turned into power, was now staring Judge Langston in the face. All Naomi knew was this. She was walking back into that courtroom, and she would finish what she started. Even if the system stood against her, even if her voice was the only one demanding to be heard. Because justice wasn't just something she believed in. It was something she embodied, quietly, fiercely, relentlessly. And as the clock above the hallway ticked closer to 1:30 p.m., Naomi gathered her papers, stood tall, and walked toward those courtroom doors. still unaware that the balance of power was about to shift. In a courtroom, Judge Victor Langston stared at the article in front of him, motionless, the edges of the bulletin trembling slightly in his hand. The sunlight that had spilled gently through his chamber window moments ago now felt cold, distant, even accusatory. The bold headlines stared back at him like a judgment rendered from a higher bench. Naomi Washington, elected first black woman, president of the Texas Bar Association. He read it once, then again. Each sentence landed with the weight of a gavel, delivering blows not to his courtroom, but to his conscience. Harvard Law, class of 2002, top of her class, a trailblazer, hundreds of pro bono cases, founder of a statewide legal aid network, two-time nominee for a federal judgeship, declined both times. Not because she wasn't qualified, but because she believed real justice didn't live in marble buildings. It lived in the streets, in shelters, in clinics, in courtrooms like his. And he had reduced her to a punchline, a warning, an example of what happens when someone dares to walk in late. 7 minutes. He closed his eyes and exhaled slowly, feeling something heavy slide through his chest. This wasn't just a bad call. This wasn't a tough but fair moment of discipline. No, this had been something else entirely. And now, with the truth of who she was lying bare before him, he could no longer deny it. He hadn't judged Naomi Washington by her merits. He judged her by her presence, by the sound of her heels clicking against the floor, by the way she had walked into his courtroom with confidence, by the color of her skin and the sharpness of her mind. He hadn't seen her as a colleague. He'd seen her as a disruption. The realization settled into his bones like a sickness. He rose from his chair and walked slowly to the window, the bulletin still clutched in his hand. Outside, the courthouse square buzzed with life. Clerks returning from lunch, attorneys on their phones, law students in clusters, discussing the morning's trial with low voices and furrowed brows. And there, on a distant bench, sat Naomi Washington, alone, her posture straight, her attention fixed on a stack of papers in her lap, reviewing, preparing, focused, still unaware of what he now knew. Langston turned away from the glass. His hands, once steady and practiced from years on the bench, now trembled slightly as he reached for the leather-bound notebook on the corner of his desk, his private journal. He had kept it since his first year as a judge, an exercise in discipline, reflection, and occasionally penance. He opened to a blank page. The pen hovered for a moment before touching paper. March 27th, 1:07 p.m. Today I saw myself clearly, and I did not like what I saw. I treated Naomi Washington with disrespect. I silenced her. I undermined her. Not because she lacked professionalism or preparation, but because of a bias I didn't want to believe I had. I didn't judge her by law. I judged her by something else. I did not judge through law. I judged through unconscious bias. The words bled from his pen like confession. He remembered her voice, steady despite his interruptions, her calm when he dismissed her documentation, her dignity when he waved off her logic like it was an inconvenience. She had not raised her voice. She hadn't stormed out. She hadn't cracked. And still he had treated her like she didn't belong, because deep down, some part of him had believed that. He closed the journal and sat back down at his desk, gripping the arms of his chair. For years, he had prided himself on being strict but fair, efficient, unshakable. But now that same pride felt brittle, false. It wasn't justice he had enforced. It was control. Judge Langston reached for the phone on his desk, his fingers trembling slightly as he pressed the intercom button. His throat felt dry, like something heavy had lodged there ever since he read Naomi Washington's name on the cover of that bulletin. He had made hundreds of rulings in his career, thousands. But this one, this moment, felt different. It felt like standing at the edge of something irreversible. "Susan," he said, voice low but deliberate. "Yes, Your Honor," came the reply through the speaker. "I need two things," he said, staring out the window as Naomi sat alone in the courtyard below, still reviewing her documents with the calm of someone who had weathered storms no one else could see. "First, cancel the contempt fine issued this morning against Miss Naomi Washington, effective immediately. Make sure the paperwork reflects that it was revoked by the bench prior to payment. A pause, then, "Understood, Your Honor." "And second," he added, his voice tightening, "I need a formal statement prepared for the court record. I'll be reading it aloud at the beginning of the afternoon session. Make sure the court reporter is ready. Every word must go on record." Susan hesitated. "Would you like me to draft the apology for review?" "No," Langston said, shaking his head slowly. "This one has to come from me." He ended the call and let the silence of his chambers settle over him like a thick fog. The gavel on his desk, polished and weighty, suddenly felt like a relic of arrogance rather than authority. That morning he had used it not to uphold justice, but to suppress it, to silence a woman who had given her life to the very system he claimed to serve. He had weaponized procedure to diminish principle, and now he would answer for it. He opened a blank page on his yellow legal pad and began to write. No legalese, no evasion, no performance. Just truth. He would name what he did. He would say it plainly, not because it absolved him, but because the courtroom deserved to hear it. She deserved to hear it. Downstairs, the hallways buzzed as lawyers returned from lunch, unaware of what was coming. But up in his chambers, Judge Langston wrote slowly, deliberately, aware that each word was more than an apology. It was the beginning of making things right. More shocking twists are ahead. Don't miss a moment. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to stay with us. Thank you for standing for truth and justice. Where are you watching from? Let us know. The clock struck 1:30 p.m. and the doors to courtroom 3A creaked open once more. But this time, the energy inside was entirely different. The morning's sharp-edged tension had not disappeared. It had evolved, matured into something volatile and electric. Word had spread like wildfire throughout the courthouse. Judge Langston was going to address the courtroom personally, and not just with legal instructions, with something different. Clerks lingered at the back. Law students returned with friends in tow. Even attorneys from unrelated cases found excuses to squeeze in, hoping to witness what many whispered might be the most unprecedented moment of Judge Langston's career. Naomi Washington entered without hesitation. Her gait remained calm, unbothered, dignified. But even she could feel the shift in the air. Something had changed, though she didn't yet know what. She took her place at the defense table beside Mr. Ortega, who leaned toward her whispering, "Everyone's watching you." Naomi didn't reply. She didn't need to. Her presence said everything. The bailiff stood tall and called out, "All rise." And then he appeared. Judge Victor Langston stepped onto the bench not with the self-assured posture he had worn that morning, but with something far rarer, gravity. His face was unreadable, but his movements were slower, more deliberate. He didn't immediately reach for the gavel. Instead, he removed his reading glasses and set them down gently. Then he looked directly, unflinchingly, at Naomi Washington. The room went silent. "Before we continue," Langston began, his voice low but echoing with clarity, "I have something I need to say." Naomi's eyes narrowed just slightly. Her back straightened. She hadn't expected this. Langston took a breath. "This morning," he continued, "I spoke to Miss Washington in a manner that was unprofessional, dismissive, and, most importantly, unjust." A wave of shock rippled through the courtroom. "I interrupted her multiple times. I dismissed her statements before they were even fully spoken. I questioned her integrity, and I issued a contempt fine without allowing her a fair opportunity to explain herself." He paused, his gaze never breaking from hers. "I was wrong." The words landed like thunder. Not a sound stirred. "I judged not by the law," he said, his voice growing heavier, "but by something much more insidious. I allowed unconscious bias to influence my behavior. That is not justice. That is not fairness. And it is certainly not the standard this courtroom, or any courtroom, should uphold." Naomi blinked, stunned. She had faced years of obstacles, of quiet indignities and overt slights, but never had she seen a judge stand up and name it, out loud, on the record. "I am hereby rescinding the contempt citation and eliminating the associated fine in full," Langston declared. "Furthermore, I am entering this apology, every word of it, into the official court record." People began to shift in their seats, unsure if they were witnessing history or some kind of legal hallucination. Langston wasn't finished. "Miss Washington," he said, and this time there was a crack in his voice. Not weakness, but the weight of truth. "You demonstrated professionalism and composure in the face of disrespect. And for that, you've earned more than my apology. You've earned my respect." For a long moment, silence gripped courtroom 3A like a steel vise. The judge's words still hung in the air, unexpected, raw, and echoing with something rarely heard from the bench: humility. Naomi Washington stood motionless behind the defense table, the soft rustle of her papers the only sound in the room. All eyes were on her now, not with skepticism, not with condescension, but with something closer to reverence. Then slowly, deliberately, she rose to her feet. Her expression was calm, composed, her back impossibly straight. The same composure she had worn all morning, as she endured interruption after interruption. The same quiet fire she carried through every gavel strike meant to silence her. But now, as she stood in front of a courtroom full of stunned observers and a humbled judge, there was something else in her gaze, something higher. Grace. She looked directly at Judge Langston, not with bitterness, but with the clear, piercing eyes of someone who had seen injustice and chosen not to become it. "I accept your apology, Your Honor," she said, her voice smooth and steady, each word laced with power. "But this moment, this reckoning, is not just about me." The silence in the room deepened. No one moved. She stepped slightly forward, not to command the space, but to speak into it, like she was filling a void that had gone unacknowledged for far too long. "It's about something bigger than a missed minute, or a gavel strike, or a single courtroom," she continued. "It's about how we listen, who we choose to listen to, and how the pursuit of justice can so easily become a weapon. When we forget that behind every case file, every argument, every late arrival is a human being." Her words didn't rise in volume, but their weight intensified with every syllable. "I've been in courtrooms across this state. I've defended people who had no voice. I've stood before judges who never once looked me in the eye. And I've won, not because the system made it easy, but because I refused to let it break me." Naomi paused. Her hands rested lightly on the edge of the defense table. The room was still. The gallery, packed with students, clerks, and attorneys, hung on her every word. "And today I'm reminded of something I say often to my students, to my mentees, to the young lawyers who think they have to shout to be heard." She looked around the room, then back at the bench. "Justice must learn to listen." The sentence hit like a bolt of lightning, sharp, clear, impossible to ignore. Even Judge Langston bowed his head for a breath, as if the words struck a place in him deeper than guilt. They struck a place called truth. For a few seconds, the room held its breath. Then, from the back row, a single clap, software, isolated, hesitant, then another, and another, until a gentle wave of applause rippled through the courtroom. It wasn't rowdy, it wasn't theatrical. It was restrained, reverent, like a collective exhale from everyone who had felt the imbalance of the morning and now finally saw it being set right. Naomi didn't bask in it. She simply nodded once, then quietly sat down, her presence still commanding, her grace unquestioned. Judge Langston cleared his throat, visibly moved, but said nothing. There was nothing left to say. His power had already shifted, not taken but returned to its rightful balance. In the gallery, a young law student wiped tears from her eyes. A clerk leaned closer to a colleague and whispered, "That's how you change a courtroom." Even the corporate attorneys at the plaintiff's table looked uncomfortable now, shrinking into their seats under the weight of their earlier smirks. And still, Naomi sat quietly, because she didn't need vindication. She was the vindication, not through fury, through restraint, not through accusation, through truth. Courtroom 3A would never be the same, not because a judge admitted he was wrong, but because a woman who had every reason to burn the place down chose instead to rebuild it with words that couldn't be cross-examined. Justice must learn to listen, and in that room on that day it finally did. The courthouse corridors buzzed long after the gavel had fallen. Word of the afternoon's unprecedented events had spread beyond courtroom 3A. Past the law clerks, the bailiffs, the court reporters, people whispered Naomi Washington's name with a reverence once reserved for legends. But while others speculated, Naomi remained focused, calm, and composed, unmoved by the attention. She had walked into that courtroom for one reason: to defend her client. The rest had simply been truth demanding to be heard. Judge Langston found her near the west stairwell, her case files tucked neatly under her arm, ready to leave. For a man who had built a career on authority, control, and distance, he now looked deeply human, shoulders heavy, expression earnest. He cleared his throat softly before speaking, his voice quieter than it had been all day. "Miss Washington," he began, "do you have a moment?" She turned to face him, her expression neutral, unreadable. "I wanted to say, off the record, thank you," he said, "not just for your professionalism today, but for your words. They struck deeper than I expected." Naomi gave a slow nod. "Sometimes the truth has a way of doing that." He managed a small smile, one that faded quickly into something more serious. "I've spent years thinking I ran a fair courtroom, but today I saw how blind I've been, how easy it is to believe you're impartial when you've never had to prove yourself the way others do." He paused, choosing his next words with care. "I want to do more than just apologize. I want to change how we do things here, and I need your help." Naomi studied him in silence. There was no triumph in her eyes, only calculation. She had heard promises before, hollow ones, apologies that never left the hallway. She wasn't moved by intentions. She was moved by action. "I appreciate the offer, Your Honor," she replied. "But if this is going to be a press release, a checklist training, or some empty DEI seminar, then I'm not interested." Langston blinked. Naomi stepped closer, her voice unwavering. "If we're going to fix this system, it can't be cosmetic. We need to tear into the roots, review judicial conduct, create real accountability, bring in people from the outside, not just the same names passed around in legal circles." She wasn't negotiating. She was drawing a line. "If you're serious," she continued, "we'll build something together. But it has to be real. No more performative justice. No more silence disguised as professionalism." Langston nodded slowly. "I'm serious." "Good," she said. "Then let's get to work." And just like that, the courtroom battle became a movement. Not with banners or chants, but with policy drafts and late-night meetings. The judge who once silenced her was now the one listening. And the woman he tried to diminish became the architect of reform. Because Naomi Washington didn't just walk into a courtroom that day, she walked out with the power to rebuild it. In the weeks following the explosive day in courtroom 3A, Naomi Washington and Judge Victor Langston began quietly laying the groundwork for reform. The corridors of the courthouse became their meeting rooms. Dimly lit chambers became war rooms where old biases met fresh perspectives head-on. Naomi's insistence on action, not symbolism, transformed Langston's vague promises into a battle plan with concrete targets. They understood clearly what they were up against: a justice system entrenched in tradition, resistant to scrutiny, and hostile to change. Their first project was ambitious: comprehensive anti-bias training for every courthouse employee, from judges and bailiffs to clerks and administrative staff. Naomi insisted on bringing in experts, psychologists, historians, racial justice scholars, people who could dissect not just legal procedure, but the invisible biases that lurk behind every ruling. The training sessions were intense, uncomfortable, and revealing. Voices trembled as veteran court officers confronted deeply rooted prejudices for the first time in their careers. Langston himself attended every session, sitting quietly at the back, his presence an unspoken acknowledgement of his past failures and future commitment. But Naomi knew awareness alone wasn't enough. She was determined to shift the culture at a structural level, to dismantle the invisible walls that had almost silenced her that day in court. She proposed a mentorship program aimed explicitly at law students and young attorneys from marginalized communities, those who traditionally lacked connections, resources, or role models in the legal profession. The courthouse quickly became a space of learning and empowerment. Naomi personally mentored dozens of young lawyers, guiding them through the challenges she herself had faced. Her mentees learned not only how to argue a case, but how to hold their ground when the system pushed back. Langston watched with a mixture of respect and quiet shame as Naomi and her growing team of protégés brought fresh energy into previously sterile hallways. These young advocates weren't just gaining legal skills, they were reclaiming spaces from which their voices had historically been excluded. The courthouse felt different now, more alive, charged with possibility. As the mentorship program took root, Naomi and Langston introduced another critical innovation: an anonymous community feedback system. For the first time, members of the public had a safe channel to speak honestly about their courtroom experiences. Within days, stories poured in, testimonies from people who'd felt humiliated, ignored, or mistreated in courtrooms throughout the county. Naomi read each account, her heart tightening at familiar echoes of her own experience. Yet she turned this anger into fuel, channeling it into action. Every piece of feedback became evidence, and every story of injustice reinforced the urgency of their work. In parallel, Naomi pushed to dramatically expand the courthouse's pro bono legal aid program, determined that no person in their community should lose a case simply because they lacked resources. She organized workshops, raised funds, rallied support from local law firms, and swiftly built a coalition of attorneys eager to donate their time. Dozens of previously hopeless cases found powerful representation, reversing evictions, correcting wrongful arrests, and restoring dignity where the system had failed. Months passed, and skepticism gave way to tangible results. A quiet revolution was underway, fueled not by slogans or speeches, but by the steady, relentless force of reform. The impact of Naomi's leadership became undeniable. Courthouse statistics began to shift dramatically. Complaints of biased treatment dropped sharply. Community members felt heard, respected, and safe in a courtroom environment once seen as hostile territory. Young minority attorneys, previously unsure of their place in the legal community, stood confidently before judges who now viewed them not with suspicion, but with respect. One afternoon, Naomi stood at the courthouse entrance, gazing across the busy lobby. She watched as a young black law student, one of her mentees, confidently approached a judge to ask a question. The exchange was warm, respectful, and genuine, a simple interaction that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. "You changed all of this," a voice said quietly beside her. Naomi turned to see Judge Langston standing there, eyes filled with quiet admiration. "No," Naomi replied calmly, meeting his gaze. "We changed this because we finally listened." Langston nodded, acknowledging the hard-earned wisdom in her words. They had built something remarkable together, a framework for genuine justice, not one rooted in empty promises or symbolic gestures, but anchored deeply in fairness, empathy, and respect. Yet Naomi knew their work wasn't done. She recognized the relentless persistence of injustice. Bias, she understood, would always lurk beneath the surface, waiting patiently to reclaim lost ground. She wasn't naive enough to believe they'd solved everything, but she had seen the power of action over words, of truth over convenience. As evening sunlight streamed through the courthouse windows, illuminating the marble walls with a soft glow, Naomi felt a quiet surge of pride, not in personal triumph, but in collective possibility. She had entered this courthouse under fire, silenced by prejudice, doubted by those in power. Now, months later, she stood shoulder to shoulder with the man who had once embodied everything wrong with the system, both committed to dismantling the very structures that had failed so many. Together, they had proven that justice wasn't just a theory, it was a practice. It was listening. It was doing better every day without compromise. Exactly 1 year after that unforgettable day in courtroom 3A, Naomi once again stood before an audience. But this time, instead of facing skepticism, hostility, and prejudice, she stood beneath the towering arches of the Texas State Convention Center, a vast auditorium filled to capacity with judges, attorneys, legal scholars, community leaders, and aspiring young advocates from across the state. The conference, aptly named the Fair Justice Summit, was the culmination of months of relentless dedication and transformative reform. As Naomi approached the podium, a powerful hush fell over the audience, an electric anticipation weaving through the silence. Camera lights flickered from news crews lining the walls, eager to document the historic moment unfolding before them. Naomi briefly scanned the sea of faces before her. Hundreds of men and women gathered not just to talk, but to listen. In the front row sat Judge Victor Langston, his expression calm and respectful. For a brief moment, their eyes met, sharing an unspoken acknowledgement of how far they both come since that fateful encounter. Naomi took a deep breath, feeling the familiar surge of determination that had propelled her through countless battles. Memories flashed vividly through her mind, the contempt fine, the interruptions, the icy disdain of that day, and the crushing injustice she'd faced. She exhaled slowly, steadying herself, then began speaking in a clear, powerful voice. 1 year ago, I stood in a courtroom that wasn't ready to hear me, not because I lacked competence, preparation, or evidence, but because unconscious bias had deafened it. The room tightened with intensity, her words ringing out sharply. Naomi continued, "But today we gather here as living proof that systems can learn, people can change, and justice, real justice, is never static, but always evolving." As she spoke, a large screen behind her illuminated with powerful images, courtroom trainings, mentoring sessions, anonymous community feedback boxes overflowing with handwritten notes, and teams of lawyers volunteering late into the night. Together with Judge Langston and many dedicated colleagues present here today, we have transformed promises into action, not mere symbolic gestures, but profound structural reform. Naomi raised her hand toward the screen, now showing faces of courthouse staff, bailiffs, clerks, judges, participating in intense anti-bias training workshops. Every member of our judicial system in these courthouses participated in rigorous training designed to confront uncomfortable truths. And because courage is not the absence of discomfort, but the choice to act despite it, we now stand here today with tangible results. A bold graph appeared on screen, the dramatic downward curve unmistakable. Reports of discriminatory treatment across 23 courthouses statewide have decreased by over 70%. 70% fewer people now leave our courts feeling diminished or unheard. An audible gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by an enthusiastic burst of applause. Naomi paused, allowing the gravity of the moment to resonate deeply. "But perhaps our greatest achievement goes beyond statistics," she resumed, voice steady yet deeply passionate. "Today, dozens of young attorneys from diverse backgrounds, lawyers who once felt sidelined or silenced, now approach the bench with confidence, assured that their voices, their arguments, their dignity will no longer be undermined." The screen now showed young lawyers in vibrant dialogue with senior judges, their expressions bright with newfound confidence. "One young woman told me recently," Naomi shared with genuine emotion, "that for the first time, she argued a case without fearing how she'd be judged. Not on her skills or argument, but on her gender, her race, or the background from which she came." The audience sat in profound silence, absorbing every word. Naomi pressed on, her voice filled with quiet intensity. "Justice is not an abstract principle. It is the daily practice of fairness and respect. It is listening, truly listening, to voices we have long overlooked." She glanced again toward Langston, whose eyes now glistened with quiet pride. Naomi's expression softened as she pointed to a familiar face on screen, James Ortega, her former client, now smiling brightly as he stood beside a community legal aid booth. James Ortega once faced ruin because the system chose not to listen. Today, he volunteers tirelessly in our expanded community legal aid program, ensuring that no one else experiences what he endured. The audience erupted into heartfelt applause as James stood briefly from his seat in the middle of the crowd, smiling modestly as he waved. Naomi's voice grew stronger, her conviction unwavering. "We have built anonymous channels to receive honest community feedback, where previously silenced experiences now shape our policies directly. Because justice, genuine justice, thrives on accountability and transparency." She paused deliberately, the entire room holding its breath. "Yet our work is far from complete. Bias and injustice are resilient foes, waiting patiently, quietly, to reclaim lost ground. But we will remain vigilant. Naomi's voice rose, clear and commanding. We have proven that justice can evolve, not through empty promises or easy slogans, but through meaningful, courageous action. We've demonstrated that fairness can flourish in spaces once hostile through the simple yet revolutionary act of listening. As she approached the close of her address, the entire audience was captivated. Naomi leaned slightly forward, speaking softly, yet with compelling power. True justice isn't found merely in verdicts of guilty or innocent, nor in who wins or loses a case. True justice emerges from our willingness to listen, learn, and most importantly, change. She paused briefly, the weight of her message echoing powerfully. Let today be a clear reminder. Justice is not static. It demands action, empathy, and courage. It demands accountability. And above all, it demands the humility to admit when we have failed. She took a deep breath, eyes briefly closing as she gathered her final words. When she opened them again, her gaze pierced through every heart in the auditorium. Justice is never fully achieved in a single ruling or a solitary speech. It is the quiet yet unyielding pursuit of a fairer system for everyone who walks through our courthouse doors. It is a call we must answer each day, with each interaction, in every courtroom. Naomi stepped back from the podium, and for a heartbeat, absolute silence filled the vast space. Then slowly, one by one, the audience rose. First Judge Langston, then James Ortega, followed by hundreds of judges, lawyers, students, and community leaders, until the entire auditorium stood in a unified, powerful ovation. Naomi, dignified and humble, nodded appreciatively, her eyes sparkling with quiet determination. As applause resonated throughout the auditorium, it was clear to all present that they were not simply applauding a woman who'd overcome incredible adversity. They were celebrating a transformation long overdue, a seismic shift that Naomi had ignited, a movement redefining justice itself. As Naomi left the stage, the applause continued, vibrant and unrelenting. Langston approached, offering a gentle handshake and whispered words of gratitude. "You changed more than my courtroom, Naomi. You changed me." She met his gaze with grace and quiet strength. "We changed it together because we chose to listen." One bright, clear morning, sunlight spilled across the polished marble floor of the Harris County Courthouse lobby, illuminating a newly installed portrait that hung prominently on the courthouse's central wall. Lawyers, clerks, judges, and visitors stopped to look, pausing mid-stride as their eyes absorbed the powerful image before them. In the photograph, Naomi Washington and Judge Victor Langston stood side by side, their shoulders level, their gazes steady, radiating confidence, strength, and above all, mutual respect. Beneath their feet, in bold lettering, read a single profound statement: "Justice begins with courage." Those 4 words etched boldly beneath the image resonated like an unspoken declaration. Courage, the willingness to face uncomfortable truths, to challenge the comfortable familiarity of injustice, to confront one's own biases openly, had transformed the courthouse. It was courage that had reshaped courtroom after courtroom across Texas, courage that had turned adversaries into allies, and courage that now stood immortalized upon this wall. Nearby, Judge Langston stood quietly with Naomi, both reflecting silently as passers-by glanced toward them with respectful nods and subtle smiles. The courthouse felt different these days, charged with a new energy, a sense of calm yet dynamic purpose. But Langston remembered vividly how it once had been. His mind drifted back to that morning years ago, when he had silenced Naomi, fined her unjustly, and allowed prejudice, not justice, to steer his judgment. That day haunted him still, the sharpness of his voice, the cold indifference he'd shown her, and how swiftly he'd wielded his gavel as a weapon rather than a tool of fairness. It was a memory now softened by redemption, but never forgotten, a scar that reminded him daily of his responsibility as a guardian of justice. He sighed softly, breaking the comfortable silence. "You know, Naomi," Langston began quietly, his voice gentle yet firm, tinged with quiet reflection. "Of all the changes we've implemented here, Of all the reforms we've pushed forward, I'm proudest of the fact that the young attorneys who come here today don't even know what happened back then." Naomi looked at him, her eyes thoughtful, serene, patient. "For these young lawyers, fairness in the courtroom is no longer something they hope for," Langston continued. "It's not something extraordinary they have to fight desperately to achieve. It's just normal, expected, taken for granted." He turned slowly, watching as a group of newly minted attorneys entered the lobby. Bright-eyed, confident, unburdened by the shadows of the past, they moved freely through the courthouse doors, greeting colleagues, preparing for the day's trials. Langston felt his chest swell with quiet pride and deep humility. They step into this courtroom knowing they'll be heard, that they'll be judged solely on their merits, and that, he paused, his voice thickening slightly with emotion, "that's the legacy you and I built." Naomi smiled softly, her gaze unwavering as she turned toward him. "You're right, Victor," she replied gently. "But remember, true change isn't just about forgetting the struggles. It's about reaching a point where no one has to face those struggles at all, where justice is so thoroughly woven into the fabric of the system that fairness isn't remarkable. It's simply the standard." She paused, her words lingering heavily between them, each syllable charged with powerful conviction. "Real progress," Naomi continued, her voice rising just slightly, "is when no lawyer, no defendant, no client ever again has to beg for basic dignity, when no one has to stand alone, silenced by the prejudice of those in power." Langston nodded solemnly. Naomi's words resonated deeply. They were a reminder that, despite their progress, the pursuit of justice remained a constant and vigilant struggle, one that required humility, honesty, and continuous self-reflection. They stood quietly, shoulder to shoulder beneath their own image. Attorneys, clerks, and courthouse staff continued to move around them, each absorbed in their own tasks, yet unconsciously benefiting from the very courage and persistence embodied by Naomi and Langston's reforms. As the two watched in comfortable silence, James Ortega entered the lobby, now proudly wearing a badge identifying him as a senior volunteer coordinator in the Community Legal Aid Office. He moved through the lobby with quiet confidence, greeting visitors, assisting new clients, an embodiment of the profound impact Naomi and Langston's reforms had achieved. Catching sight of Naomi and Langston, James paused briefly to wave, a subtle nod of gratitude passing between them before he resumed his purposeful stride. Seeing James brought fresh clarity to Naomi's voice as she turned again to Langston. "Remember him, Victor?" she asked quietly. "When we first met, James was nearly destroyed by a system blind to its own prejudice. But today he's leading others through that same system, transforming injustice into hope." Langston exhaled softly, his expression humbled, thoughtful. "I remember," he replied quietly. "His story and yours remind me daily that justice is not merely rules and laws, but people, real lives shaped by our actions." Naomi nodded, a slight powerful smile playing on her lips. "Exactly. The courage we speak of isn't just bravery in the courtroom, Victor. It's the courage to challenge ourselves, to admit when we've failed, to change even when it's painful, and above all, to listen when it's uncomfortable." Langston's eyes reflected deep understanding. "I've learned," he admitted slowly, "that the hardest cases we face aren't on the docket. They're within us. The battles against our own biases, the assumptions we unknowingly make. That's why true justice, real justice, starts with bravery. It starts here." He gently tapped his chest, inside. They stood silently again, absorbing the gravity of their own words. Their reforms had not merely reshaped a courthouse, they had reshaped them. Together, through conflict and reconciliation, humility and strength, they had created lasting change rooted not in superficial reform, but in the transformative power of empathy and respect. Across the lobby, young attorneys gathered excitedly near a mentorship program poster, their expressions bright with optimism, unburdened by the scars of past injustices. They had inherited a courthouse where respect was standard, fairness unquestioned. Naomi turned toward Langston once more, her voice filled with quiet resolve. "You're right to be proud, Victor. These young lawyers, they won't remember the day justice failed us. They'll never know the pain we faced, But more importantly, they'll never have to. Langston drew in a deep, thoughtful breath. He had always thought justice required rigid control, authority wielded with stern impartiality. But Naomi had shown him differently. Justice required humility, listening, courage, the kind he hadn't known he possessed until forced to confront his own shortcomings. Naomi, he began softly, sincerity deepening his tone, I once silenced your voice without a second thought. Yet today I listen to you and to others, not because the rules force me, but because true justice demands it. For that lesson, his voice lowered respectfully, I'll forever be grateful. Naomi gently touched his shoulder, a quiet, dignified gesture of mutual respect. We both learned, Victor, she said softly. Justice isn't just what we deliver from the bench, it's what we demand from ourselves each day. It's courage, the courage to change, to grow, to listen. Together they stood beneath their own image, a quiet testament to the transformative power of courage, humility, and relentless pursuit of true fairness. As the courthouse bustled around them, one young law student paused beneath their photograph, quietly reading the inscription aloud to herself. Justice begins with courage. She glanced toward Naomi and Langston, recognizing them from the portrait. Their calm, confident presence radiated a strength that inspired her deeply. She nodded respectfully, receiving warm smiles from both. Unaware of past struggles, untouched by previous injustices, she moved forward, ready to practice law in a place where fairness and dignity were no longer goals to achieve, but rights assured. Naomi watched her go, pride swelling quietly within. That, she said softly to Langston, is what justice looks like. Langston smiled knowingly. Yes, he agreed. When courage becomes so natural, it no longer requires praise. That is when justice truly begins. They stood together, silent once more, hopeful and resolute beneath the portrait, a living, breathing testament that even the harshest injustices can be transformed when met with courage and humility. And in that moment, justice, real, enduring justice, felt not only possible, but profoundly, permanently alive. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.